One of the questions I often get from teenagers is, what if Jesus just never existed, right? What if the whole story was a fabrication? And teenagers will sometimes think of it like this. They'll think, oh, well, maybe, maybe the Roman government just invented it, right? Maybe some emperor like Constantine. Okay, Constantine was the first Christian emperor. Maybe he just invented Christianity, invented the story of Christ in order to try to get everyone to work together or something. And usually teenagers say stuff like this simply because they don't know their history. The reality is there is almost no one who has studied this, almost no scholars who actually believe that Jesus never existed, right? And you're going, oh, Peter, come on, you're biased. You're a Catholic youth minister. Yeah, I am biased, and I am a Catholic youth minister, but even an unbiased source, you go to Wikipedia and right away look up the historicity of Christ, okay? And right away it's gonna be like, pretty much everyone agrees the dude existed. Okay, there is this small group called Jesus mythicists who think he didn't exist. I do have one friend who is in that category, but even he acknowledges that it's a bit of a fringe category, all right? The Jesus mythicist idea is that Jesus never existed at all, and people just fabricated stories about him, all right? Most people, scholars who are not Christian will agree that Jesus existed, but they're going to debate about, did he really rise from the dead? And obviously, if you're going to debate that, they're going to debate about all the other miracles that Christ supposedly performed. Now, I think there's plenty of evidence that Jesus did, in fact, rise from the dead, that he was who he said he was. He wasn't a liar, right? There's plenty of that. I'm not going to go into that today. All I want to talk about is the evidence that he existed in the first place. See, usually if someone's going to argue, especially a teenager, they want to say, oh, well, how do you know Jesus existed? We only have one source that confirms that he existed. All you have is the Bible. The first thing you need to know is we don't just have the Bible. The second thing you need to know is the Bible's not just one source, all right? In the New Testament, the authors who tell us about Jesus, the different people who've written it, well, there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, Peter, James, Jude. So those are just the sources that are in Scripture that we know about, right? We don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews. And so there are all these sources, all these authors from the first century who wrote about Jesus, who clearly believed that he was the Messiah, that he rose from the dead, and this is what they wrote. But those are just the ones that were accepted into Scripture. See, what you need to know is the reason those books are in the Bible is because the early church said, what are the most reliable sources we have about Jesus? Let's compile them all together in what is called the canon or the standard, put them in one spot, and those are going to be the sources for us. That's going to be our scriptures. But there were other sources too. There was the Shepherd of Hermas. There's something called the Didache. There's gospels that arguably were probably written actually later and were not reliable, and that's why they're not included, like the Gospel of Thomas. But there are all these early sources who really believed that Jesus rose from the dead. What about non-Christian sources? Are there? Yes, there is. The Jewish historian Josephus talks about Jesus. Tacitus talks about Jesus. Do these people believe Jesus rose from the dead? No. Does that prove that Jesus didn't rise from the dead? No. See, if Josephus did think Jesus rose from the dead, we wouldn't call him a non-Christian source, you see, because then he would actually be Christian. So the point is, there is plenty of evidence that Jesus really did exist, and again, that Jesus really did rise from the dead. The idea that he didn't exist, the theory goes something like this. Some dude made the story up. Let's say St. Paul, okay? So St. Paul makes up this story about Jesus. Now, I don't know what he thought he stood to benefit, but there are other people in history that I believe have invented religions. So maybe for whatever reason, some narcissism or something, he decides that he's going to invent this character called Jesus. And what's going to happen is then they're going to do something called syncretism. They're going to take stories from over here, stories from over there, and they're going to mix them all together and come up with the story of Jesus. So it's like if you're going to make stuff up, I figure by the time you're going to make the story up, you can be a bit more creative than this. But what they do is they say, oh, look, there's this Egyptian god, Isis, and it's kind of like he rose from the dead. And so we're going to make Jesus rise from the dead. Well, listen, If people are going to make up stories, like we do it all the time, right? Gandalf rose from the dead, sort of, right? And if Jesus came and lived today and rose from the dead, someone would, oh, you were inspired by Gandalf, right? The reality is there are myths that have similar components to what there is in Christianity, but it gets exaggerated. It's worth reading the Isis story for yourself, and you'll find, it's not really all that similar to the story of Jesus. And then they'll be like, oh, and then maybe they took this story from Buddha, and then they took this story from Greek mythology, mixed it together. If you're going to make up a story, look, if I did that nowadays and all of a sudden you looked at this book that I wrote and you said, well, hold on a second, that's Harry Potter, that's Luke Skywalker, that's Gandalf, and you mixed their stories together, you're not going to believe my story. You're going to accuse me of plagiarism. You're going to say you made this character up. It's worth noting that no one in the early centuries thought Christians had made up the story of Jesus existing. Like, that argument wasn't made. The argument was he didn't really rise from the dead. Y'all are lying about that. But nobody says he didn't really exist. So I don't find this idea that they just mixed a bunch of myths together all that compelling. I first came across this argument a few years ago when someone sent me a YouTube video called Zeitgeist. Now listen, this was in the early days of YouTube videos before we recognized just how incredulous we should be about them, right? Conspiracy theories nowadays, we're living through another era where conspiracy theories can just take off. This video looked really credible at first when I was watching it. But it made a few false claims about Christianity, and I happen to be well enough educated in Christianity that I could spot those claims. The difficulty is the average viewer probably wouldn't spot it. So I was watching it, and I was kind of nitpicking it and going, yeah, well, and so this teenager had asked me what my thoughts were, so I'm like, okay, well, I'll tell him about this, and I'm not sure about that South Star theory and all this kind of stuff. And so I'm coming up with all these kind of counter arguments, but as I'm watching Zeitgeist, I start thinking to myself, this feels like a 9/11 conspiracy movie. See, the 9/11 conspiracy is this. You remember the Twin Towers that fell on September 11th? All right, the conspiracy theory is that maybe it was an inside job, maybe, George Bush hired someone, or maybe the guy who owned the towers hired someone to blow up the building, and they pretended an airplane crashed, and it's all a lie. There was a few of those videos out there at that time. So as I'm watching it, I'm starting to go, this feels like one of those conspiracy videos. And I started thinking in my mind, it reminds me of the 9/11 videos. Well, back then, YouTube only let you put up 10-minute videos at a time. And so what happened is the video ends at 10 minutes and then you have to go hit the second part. Well, sure enough, in the second part, it segues from a Jesus was just a myth and the syncretization of all these different myths. It segues from that to saying, anything can be justified in the name of religion, and it became a 9/11 conspiracy movie. But then, once it was already into the conspiracies, then it started talking about how there's a massive worldwide conspiracy to control the money. And then, in the last section, it took this really flaky twist where it started talking about some new age future utopia that they're going to build. And frankly, if you thought the first part was credible, by the end, you're just going, this isn't realistic. The argument that Jesus didn't exist, it's out there. There's intelligent people who believe it. There's this one PhD out there, Robert Price. He holds this idea, and he's gotten popular on the internet. They are not professors at the major universities. The vast, vast majority of scholars, Christian and non-Christian alike, agree that Jesus existed. The question that Jesus asked his apostles, and that he's asking you is, who do you say that he is? God bless.